Okay, let's start. So, today I want to do secondary dominants, right, which are like a big topic in Harmony 2. And they're usually the first of the chromatic stuff that you start doing. In other words, stuff that goes outside of the key. Okay, so that's kind of why it's a bigger thing. And also, I'll tell you, students sometimes get kind of like confused by secondary dominants, like it's because you do have to think at a kind of extra level, or like maybe extra dimensionally, if you will. I don't want to get too heavy, but you have to think sort of outside of the normal stuff in the key. And so it can be confusing, but it's really not that bad. But I'll see if I can explain it. But if any questions come up or if nothing's clear, just let me know, okay?
Well, there's going to be just the two of us, so I'm pretty sure we'll find something.
Yeah, well, and also part of my idea of doing these summer things is that, like, if you go on to Harmony 2, like, you'll still like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like, it may not still be clear to you, that's okay, but you
You'll have
some,
an idea of it.
Yeah, they have some foundation of it, So, well, wait a minute. Yeah, okay. So, we talked before about something like the dominant seventh, and I'm going to use a D dominant seventh in this case. So we talked about that before in terms of its strength in moving towards like a particular tonal goal, right? And one of the elements of that is the tritone that's in there. In this case, F sharp to C, which is a diminished fifth. And the reason that has a good, powerful like mode is because it wants to contract in a way. We want to get the F sharp moving up to G and the C moving up to B. That again, that T to do, fa to mi type of relationship. So that dissonance we want to hear resolved, and we especially want to hear the leading tone resolved. That's tonic, and the subdominant will go down to the medium. We just tend to want to hear that in tonal music. So, if I'm in the key of C major, let's say, instead of that, and I'm writing the progression 2, 7 to 5, so I've got the 2 chord, which is this, right? So it's in the key of C, the 2 chord is a D minor 7 chord, right? It's D, F, A, and C. That's my 2, 7. Or I can put that here, D minor 7. And I'm resolving it to 5. I would probably do something like this. But the main thing is, of course, the 7th resolving down by step. Right? So, and this progression works. It works quite well. When I play that progression of this D minor 7 resolving to 5, and then we go to 1. But that D minor 7th wants to go to 5. But if you look at this D7 that I was talking about earlier with the F sharp in it, and the D minor 7, it's very much the same. The only difference is this is an F natural and that's an F sharp. Okay? So I can use that similarity and instead of using a D minor 7, turn it into a D dominant 7 by just raising the third of the chord. And then instead of a D minor 7, it becomes a D dominant 7th. And it just has that much stronger pull towards the 5 chord. So instead of this minor 7, I do, and again it has a little bit more oomph to take me to a tonic chord. So minor 7th or dominant 7th. So this is what we call a secondary dominant. Oops, and I should change that. I'll fill that in. This is what we call a secondary dominant. In that it's not a dominant that's part of the key. So in the key of C major, the dominant is this chord, the G major triad. So this one is secondary. It's outside of the key. So that's where that term secondary dominance comes from, is when we're using dominant 7th chords that are outside of the key, that we're pulling from outside of the key. And the way you think of it is, this is the dominant of the dominant in this case. So in a way, you're kind of like thinking temporarily in the key of G major to get this chord. So if this is the chord, if this is the G chord that I want to tonicize, then I think in the key of G for a minute. Here's my key of G. And I want to get the dominant of the G because the G is my target chord there. So I want to get the dominant of that. Well, that is this chord, this D7, which is built on the dominant scale degree. So from the key of G, I'm borrowing this D dominant 7 to just tonicize that chord. Okay? Does that make sense?
Slightly.
So in other words, in order to make a stronger progression from here to here, we're using the dominant 7th and we're borrowing the dominant 7th from the key of G as a way of temporarily tonicizing this chord, as a way of temporarily making this the tonic, or bring this into focus. And then we're going to move on in C. So our next chord would be, a cadence in C. So that's what we call them secondary dominants because they're outside of the key, because we're borrowing from them from a different key. And so when we notate them here, we don't do something like this. We don't say, well, that's a 2 and it's a 7th chord. We don't do that because we want to notate its special relationship to being like outside of the key. So instead of doing something like that, what we say is this: 5, 7 of 5. In other words, the dominant of the dominant in the key of C. So if this is the dominant in the key of C, the G chord, this is the dominant of that. And so when we analyze stuff, we notate it that way, as a way of kind of noting that special relationship.
Okay, now I kind of get it. I'm kind of understanding that.
Yeah. So all of these secondary dominants, or most of them, there's one exception in minor, but all these secondary dominants are chords that come from outside the key. And then we can use these secondary dominants to actually, we can tonicize any chord within the key. So within the key of, let's say, C major, we can have 5 of 2. We can have 5 of 3. We can have 5 of 4. We can have 5 of 5, just like this. This is 5, 7 of 5. We can have 5 of 6. Okay? We can actually tonicize those anywhere we want. I'll show you what that is. But everybody okay, like, so far?
It's there.
All right, let's get a little more into it. So, this is the 5, 7 of 5 is one of the more common ones, but So if this is my key of C major, and I've got the C chord, and the D chord, and E chord, F, G, the A, and B. When I, do my Roman numerals, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 diminished. And we can find a secondary dominant for any one of these chords, except for the 1 chord. We already have the dominant. That's the dominant within the key, right? That's the 5 chord. So there's no secondary dominant for the 1 chord because that's the target of the key. And then this one, which is the 7 diminished, we don't use a secondary dominant on that because then we'd be resolving to a diminished chord. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to resolve to a diminished triad because diminished triad is too unstable. So we can resolve to any of these other ones except for the 1, but not the 7. So in other words, we were just looking at the 5 chord, the G major triad. In fact, let me put the chord symbols here too. Okay, so we were just talking about this one, and what we found was that the dominant of the G chord was this D7. I'm going to use the dominant 7th. You can also actually just use the triad, but I'm going to use the dominant 7th because, again, it's a little more powerful, a little bit stronger. And then we called that 5/7 of 5 because it's the dominant of the G chord. And we can do that, again, with all or most of these chords. So, if my target is, well, let me consider. So, the chord I'm heading towards is a G chord, and the root is G. And so its dominant is D, which is a perfect 4th below, or you can think of it as a perfect 5th above, either way. So if I wanted to tonicize the D chord, what chord would I use? What'd you say?
G.
Not G. A G is a 4th above, but remember we need a 4th below or a 5th above. A. Because that's the dominant of that D chord. So if I wanted to tonicize that, I could make an A dominant 7th chord, and that would be 5/7 of 2. Oh, I need a C sharp here. And again, if you think of it like this is a D minor triad. If you think temporarily in the key of D minor, so here's D minor, here's my scale. The 5th step of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is an A, and if I build a dominant 7th on that chord, an A7, that's the dominant of the D, the 1 chord. So I'm taking this chord and using it in the key of C to provide a stronger resolution to the 2 chord. And so that would be 5/7 of 2. I can do the same thing for the E chord. So the root of the E minor triad is E. What would the dominant of that be? Just a note. B, yeah. So B would be 5 notes below the dominant. If it helps to think on a keyboard, you can, like, here's my E and here's the B, which is 5 notes above, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or here's my E, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4 below. That's that sol-do relationship. Sol-do, or sol-do. Right, so you can think of it this way. Or either one is fine, but that's what you're using the strength of that perfect fifth relationship, that dominant relationship, which is temporarily tonicized this note. So, yeah, if I built a dominant seventh on the note B, and this is a B dominant seventh. That's what's usually used for these secondary dominants. Is the dominant, so not a minor, in other words, not a minor seventh or a diminished seventh, at least in this case. We're talking about a B7, oops, B7, and that would be 5/7 of 3. Okay, so the next one I'm going to try is the F. What is the dominant of the F?
C.
C, yeah. So if I think 4 notes below, so F, C, D, I'm sorry, F, E, D, C, then that's the note C. And I'm going to build a C dominant 7, so that requires a B flat on top. That's my C7. That would be 5/7 of 4. And that is like the tonic triad, only it's got the B flat on top. And so if I'm playing, in the key of C, step is going to be to go to that F chord. So if I'm in the key of C and I hear C, but then I hear B flat, that's automatic, that's outside of the key, and that's going to take me on to the F chord, to the next one. And then we already did this one, the D7, so that's the D7 to the G. What about the A? Underswing shoes. What's 4 notes below A? E, yeah. So if I build a dominant 7th on E, and again make it a dominant 7th chord, then that's going to be an E dominant 7th, and that I'm going to call 5/7 of 6. The dominant of the 6th chord. And then again, I'm not going to tonicize the B diminished. So if I've got, my triads in the key of C, this is the 1 chord, the 2 chord, the 3 chord, 4, 5, and 6. Those are the ones I can, really tonicize. So the 1 I'm not going to tonicize. So if I do 5 of 2, this is 5 of 2 to 2. If I do 5 of 3, 5 of 3 to 3. If I do 5 of 4, 5 of 4 to 5 of 5, 5 of 5 to 5, and then 5 of 6 to 6. And then, I'm not going to tonicize. Now, actually, normally we wouldn't progress that way, because we don't write harmonic progressions that are like, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We do something like 2 to 5 to 1, or 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. And we can use the secondary dominants actually in a similar fashion, but I want to point out to you the relationship between these two so that you understand it. This is the target chord, the 2 chord and the key. This is the dominant of that. This is the target chord, the 3 chord and the key. This is the dominant of that. This is the target chord, the 4 chord. This is the dominant of that. So that's the way you want to think about these. So if you're in a key like C major, and you want to know the dominant of the 4 chord, you think 4 notes below, and that's going to give you the root. Then you have to build a dominant 7th on it. So you have to be pretty fluent in the spelling of these different 7th chords. But the 2 main ones are the dominant 7th, and the next week we'll get into the fully diminished 7th, which are used in a leading tone fashion. But those are the main ones that you have to think about, but that's why you have to be really kind of familiar with these. And again, now that you're, like if you're in the key of C, these are all my normal chords, but now you're jumping outside of the key to figure, well, I'm going to think temporarily in the key of D minor to get 5 of the D chord. I'm going to think temporarily in the key of E minor to get the 5 of the E chord. I'm going to think temporarily in the key of F to get the 5 of the F. I'm going to think temporarily in the key of A minor to get the 5 of the A minor chord. So that's what I meant earlier by like you're kind of jumping outside the key for a minute. You can think of it that way, or you can think of it as just the dominant of the dominant. But that's how you have to kind of approach this when you're thinking about these. So both when you're doing like part writing or when you're doing analysis with these secondary dominants, you have to think in the kind of extra layer on top of the tonal of the key center. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Okay if I erase this? Okay. All right. So as I said before, when we're doing this in a 4-part writing situation, let's go back to 5 of 5. Oh, and just like in, by the way, just like in harmonic progression, so 5 to 1 is a very common progression. So 5 of 5 to 1 is a very common progression, right? Or 2, 5, 1 is a common progression. So 5 of 5 to 1, 5 of 5 to 5 to 1 is a very common progression. So all those same relationships still play out. Like, I showed you, like, you can write 2, 5, 1, or you can write 5 of 5 to 5 to 1. They're both based on the same D. Let me rewrite that out.
Easier said than done.
Yeah. So, I can write the progression 2 to 5 to 1, and that would look something like this. Oops, no, be there. Or I can strengthen that progression instead by writing 5, 7 of 5 to 5 to 1, and then that's going to look something like this. With, again, so now I'm using the F sharp to make it a dominant 7th, and I put the 7th in there instead of the chord. But the voice leading is very similar. And in this case, I am using like a frustrated leading tone sort of resolution on this F sharp. Right, remember the frustrated leading tone, instead of resolving the leading tone up to the tonic, in this case the resolving it down in major third to the dominant of that particular, in that particular key. So I am using a sort of frustrated bleeding kind of presentation in that case. But the point is that so in this progression 2 to 5 to 1, the root is D. In this progression 5 and 5 to 5 to 1, the root is still D. So in other words, we're still taking advantage of these dominant, these fifth related things that are going on in the key. So D to G, D to G. Same root progression. We're just talking about using a different, using a minor triad here or a dominant seventh here. But it's the strength of the root progression that really makes it work. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about anything so far?
Are there any rules to doing this? I imagine that there's at least some sort of rule to doing this kind of.
Well, there are rules for when you resolve them, yes, so but the same rules apply to the dominant seventh, so when you set up this D dominant seventh this way, yeah, the seventh should resolve down by seventh. That's our primary thing. The other thing would be to have the leading tone resolve up to time. And you could, if you wanted to, do something like this and have it do that. That would not be, that would be the whole triple the root in the final chord, in resolving it. But because it's root position, yeah, you'd have to do that. You have to use one of those exceptions in order to avoid the parallel fifths. But otherwise, you just think of it resolving it as you would a normal dominant seventh. And then in terms of usage, we'll look at some examples in analysis, but you'll find composers bringing in these chords whenever they think it's necessary. It's just it's a taste thing. So if I write here's 2 to 5.
Secondary dominant, if you want to tonicize?
Yeah, you're tonicizing the dominant. So we talk about it a lot, like temporarily tonicizing.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, this is the tonic in the key of C.
Mm-hmm.
But with this little progression here, I'm tonicizing the G chord. Because I could take this chord progression and it's like a slice of G major, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's 5 in G major. If I was to analyze this in G major just by itself, this would be 5, 7 to 1.
Okay.
And so you're kind of pulling that progression out of G major, putting it into C major to tonicize G major. That's the idea behind that. So some people even talk about like a little modulation. We haven't covered modulation yet, but modulation is changing keys, like moving to a different key. So some people even talk about this concept of secondary dominance as like a mini modulation. I'm just sort of flirting with or moving into the key of G major for a second, and then back into C again. And it doesn't destroy the key of C. So if I'm, here's my progression in the key of C, and it's doing 1, 4, 5, 1, and then I do a dominant 7, but I still feel like C is my home, right? So, even though I use that secondary dominant, normal C major stuff, and then that's my D dominant 7, that's my 5, 5. And then I resolve it to 5, 1. And it doesn't really take away from the key, it doesn't destroy it. You could, and you'll find in doing, like, analyzing pieces that, what was I gonna say? That sometimes the line between modulation and secondary dominance is blurry. Like, well, wait a minute, is this just a sort of slice of G major, or am I doing something more in G major? And they even talk about things, so you could even have something like 2-5-1 in G major, but inserted into G minor. You know, so you'll have the 2 chord, which in G minor would be the A minor triad. In C it would be 6, in G it would be 2, and 2-5-1, you know. And so that would be like having a 6-2-5-1. You could have 6, 5, 7, and 5, 5, 1. So, you know, and so then how much of, like, as we grow and grow and grow that progression, and we think more and more in the key of G major, then you start, well, am I maybe really in G major for a little bit, you know, for like a measure or a measure and a half, or have I, you know, am I just staying in C still? And there are times when it's blurry, like what's the line? What are you going to say is a real modulation, and what are you going to say is just C major? And probably people could hear it differently. So it's a, you know, it is there's a blurry line there. Now, one of the things in terms of inversion, let's just take this same progression. It's all very straightforward in terms of like how you normally resolve a dominant. So if I was doing like, if I do 5-7, let me write this in a different 5-7 of 5 to 5. Again, that's a D7 to a G chord in C major. So if I do this, I'm going to do a different voicing just so we get something else. If I'm resolving that to, oops, sure. So there I did do a sort of triple the root thing. Yeah, I tripled the root in this one. I still want to do all those tendency tone things, right? 7th down by step, leading tone up to tonic. If I put it in inversion, so if instead I want to do 5-6-5 of 5 to 5. Scrunch that up just a bit. So then this chord, that means this chord, this D dominant 7th, is going to be in first inversion. So that means F sharp will be in the bass, because that's the 3rd of the chord. And then I'll put the A, let's say there, the D here, and the C here. So that's D, F sharp, A, and C. It's the same D dominant 7th as before. But when I resolve it, again, I'm going to resolve all the tendency tones as I normally would want to. I'm going to resolve the 7th down by step. So that's the C going down to B, just like it did here, C to B. I'm going to resolve the leading tone up to tonic. I'm probably going to get the other tonic there and then just hold on to the G. So I have a G major triad, 2 Gs, a B and a D, and I just resolve the tendency tones, the 7th down by step, leading tone up to tonic, maintain a common tone. So this is all the same resolution of the dominant 7th that we talked about before. It's just that now it's in the context of a secondary dominant. And if I do 5-4-3 of 5, then that's going to be, let's do A here, F sharp, E. Again, when I resolve them, 7th resolves down by step, leading tone up to tonic, maintain the common tone in the D. So 7th resolves down by step, 5, 4, 2, a 5. Going to 5, it's going to end up being a 5 in first inversion because the 7th is going to be the lowest sounding pitch. So when I resolve that 7th down by step, it's going to go to the 3rd chord. Let's have a little more space here. But the same rules apply. So the 7th resolved down by step, the leading tone goes up to tonic. I'm going to maintain common tone and then probably double the G there. So it's the same rules apply with these secondary dominants as applied to the dominant seventh. That's those same tendency tones happening all over again. So when I have this, then this is going to go down to here, this is going to go down to here. When I have it this way, there's my seventh key, there's my leading tone. This way, that's going to resolve here. And I can't finger that last one. That way I can. I'm just going to resolve like this. That's the part of my stretch. So yeah, same. You're always hearing this, or in the second one here, or in the third one, and the fourth one. Same tendency tones resolving the same way every time. Okay? So again, inversion, just think, think temporarily in the new key, and then do everything you would normally do with the new key. Okay. One other thing is that oftentimes, or this can happen, that these are used in a sort of a chain. So, let's go back in C major. If I was going to do some kind of long extended progression and write maybe something like 3-7 to 6-7 to 2-7 to 5-7 to 1. Okay, so then my roots, like the 3 chord, the root would be E, the 6 would be A, the 2 would be D, the 5 would be G, and finally I end up on 1, right? So it's just a kind of circle of fifths in almost. I'm just going around the circle of fifths, but I'm using some of these secondary sevenths that we talked about last time, and I would typically do something like, I'm going to omit the fifth in this first one, just but so when doing these change of root position seventh chords, you have to do some of the same things that we talked about with the dominant seventh, like omitting the fifth in every other one. So I'm going to omit the fifth here so that I can have a fifth in this one. Whoops, I need a seventh, sorry. So that's my A minor seventh. And then I will omit the fifth in this one so that I can have So we have sort of a chain of root position secondary seventh chords from an E minor seventh resolving to resolving to an A minor seventh, resolving to a D minor seventh, resolving to a G dominant seventh, and then finally to an S. And these are all diatonic seventh chords, and in each one, the seventh resolves down by six. So the seventh of this E minor seventh is D. It resolves down to the third of the next chord, C. The seventh of this A minor seventh is G. It resolves down by step to the third of this chord, D. Okay. If I did the same thing with secondary dominants, and I can just pretty much copy that progression, but in each case, instead of making it like the diatonic minor seventh, I'm going to make it a dominant seventh, and then it becomes 5, 7, 6. And then I'm going to resolve it to the sixth chord. But instead of getting the sixth chord, I'm going to do 5, 7 of 2. And I'm going to do this, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then I'm going to resolve that to the analogous D minor chord. Which would be a D dominant seventh, which would be 5, 7 of 5. And then I'm going to go to the G chord, which is just 5, 7. And then finally to 1. So you can see it's the same voice leading. The weird thing is, so in a dominant seventh, we expect the seventh to resolve down by step, which it is. So in the case of this E dominant seventh chord, the seventh is D, and it resolves down by step to the C sharp. However, this is really the leading tone in this case. We should normally want to hear it go up to A, but in order to get to an A seventh with the G natural in it, I'm going to go down chromatically instead. And that was what was commonly done in this case. So this is sort of an exception to those tendency tones. If you're doing it like a chain of secondary dominants, you'll use this chromatic slippage, like the chromatic notes slipping down instead of resolving up. So instead of resolving up a half step, like we would expect an E dominant seventh to resolve this way, right, in the leading tone, to resolve at the time. But in this case, instead of that happening, because we're going to go on to an A dominant seventh, we resolve it down by a half step. And then when we go on to the next one, we do the same thing. The C sharp is going to go from that, it's going to resolve down a half step to D. And from that, the F sharp is the bass. Instead of going up to G, we go down a half step to F major, and then resolve. So that progression of which you've probably heard before. It's not an uncommon type of progression, these chains of secondary dominants, and even that voice leading with this kind of like chromatic slippage, I think of it as. Instead of the G sharp going up to A, it goes down to G natural. Instead of the C sharp going up to D, it goes down to C natural. Instead of the F sharp going up to G, it goes down to F natural. And you need to use that voice leading, or at least that voice leading, well, you need to use it in order to avoid what was called a cross relation. have like an F sharp in one voice and then an F natural in a different voice in the next chord. So if I was doing here and I said, well, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. I want to get my G dominant seventh. I want to resolve the leading tone up to tonic. I still want to have a seventh here, so I'm going to have an F natural there. What was, we would call this a cross relation. And it was typically avoided in common practice harmony, although there are examples of which composers will exploit it. But in this kind of simple four-part style, the tradition was to avoid it because, see, you would think that an alto, hearing the tenor sing in F sharp, would go, uh-oh, I better sing F sharp, right? Like, in the previous chord, the tenors are singing F sharp, it's going to be hard for the altos to find their note, right? But if the tenors just go down a half step, if they go from Fi to Fa, then that's easier for them to do. So if the tenors are on F sharp, F sharp, they can do that more easily than the altos just pulling F sharp or F natural out of nowhere in a way. So that type of a cross relation, having an F, well, any kind of, a chromatically altered note in one voice and then the natural note in a different voice was usually avoided. For that reason, because it would be difficult for the singers to find their pitch if in the previous chord somebody was singing an altered version of that same note. So usually they would do the voice leading where they'd keep it in the same voice in order to avoid that. So that's all, you're talking about rules before, that's one of the exceptions, to that rule of like resolving the leading tone up to tonic, we instead would resolve it down a half step to the natural note, and in order to keep this kind of smooth chromatic voicing. So in the way that the tenors are just going G sharp, G, F sharp, F, right? They're just sort of snaking down as we go through this chord from this chord to this next chord to this next chord, and then into the G dominant. Okay. Questions?
So you would only have to kind of like lower it instead if it's like in the chain of seven?
Yeah, in a chain. So if you're using any part of this chain, so even if you're doing just this progression, you wanted 5/7 to 5 to 5/7, you'd want to do it there.
Oh, okay.
Because you're going to have, like in this case, you're going to have an F sharp going to an F natural or whatever, the raised fourth scale degree going to the regular fourth scale degree. So anytime you've got a secondary dominant going to a dominant seventh, you're going to have to do that. But even like here to here, we had C sharp to C.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just literally like if you're using a secondary dominant and it's going to an already dominant chord, that's when you would do it?
Yeah, dominant seventh chord.
Okay.
It's going from a secondary dominant to another dominant seventh.
Okay.
Whether it's, this is an E dominant seventh to an A dominant seventh, or whether it's the D dominant seventh going to the G dominant seventh, which is part of the key, you're going to have to do that. If I was just going to a triad, I wouldn't have to worry about that, right? Because if I was just going to a triad, then it would just be G, B, D. I don't have a seventh, so I don't need to worry about it. But if I'm going to put a seventh in there, then I want to put it in that voice.
Okay.
That's where I want to get that seventh. So that I avoid the cross relation.
Okay.
I avoid having an F sharp in one voice and then an F natural in a different voice. So maybe that's the way to think of it, like you want to avoid that, or you can think of the chromatic slippage, like that down by half step. And it's a commonly used effect. I always think you hear it in barbershop all the time, like that same kind of sound, because they'll do that. They'll use chains of seventh chords. They'll put that in the reason I bring it up is that it is like an exception, right? So, I said before we wanted to do the seventh up a step, which we're still doing, but the leading tone up to tonic. But if in this chord, even if we were going to have an A, but we were going to put a G somewhere else, we don't want to have the G natural in a different voice than we have the G sharp to avoid that cross relation. Okay? Okay. All right, let's look at some music now. Let's see. Where do we need to get this? Okay, so I want to do an analysis of this thing, at least up to a certain point, this example from a Bach. But I want to start off by doing two things. One, what key are we in? Yeah, E. And so, we would look at four sharps, and we say, okay, E, four sharps is the key of E, right? That's one. And then we look at the first chord, E, G sharp, E, B, so that's an E major triad, so that's a good indicator. We look at the final chord, E, B, E, G sharp, E major triad, so really good indication of when the key of E. Second question is, in looking at this, where do you see, do you see any secondary dominance, or do you see anything that attracts your attention that might be a secondary dominant? And this is not a trick question.
Measure 4, beat 2?
1, 2, 3, 4. Here.
Third one. Sorry. So on the third, measure second beat, where that natural is.
Well, this is bass clef, so A natural. But I'm going to back up to here to the A sharp. So if I have four sharps in the key, F, C, G, D, F, C, G, D, but I've got an A sharp, that's outside of the key, right? That's not part of the key of D major. We don't normally sharp the A in the key of D major. So if secondary dominants are chromatic chords, then that's a good candidate to be a secondary dominant, right? But let's put that on pause now. But I just want to point out that when you're looking at music and you see, something like this, it's mostly diatonic, it's mostly E majors, but then you see something that's outside of the key, then that's probably going to need some special attention, and you're going to have to give that kind of like, well, what is that? And you're probably, again, you're going to have to jump outside of the key for a minute. But let's start at the beginning and go through and analyze up to that point a little beyond it. And then we'll talk about that chord itself. So, we already said, let's see, I already said we're in the key of E major. We already said that this is a 1 chord. And in fact, this is a 1, and then this is essentially, this is still 1, right? This is E, B, E, G sharp, so that's all still 1. So where we get a different harmony is on this second beat here. So what is that chord?
So, I left you figuring it out for a part. Can you just repeat that part?
Yeah, this is 1, this is 1. What is this chord? We've got
2.
F sharp, A, D sharp, and F sharp.
2.
2?
Yeah.
The 2 chord wouldn't have the D sharp in it. Let's do. 7, yeah. That's the chord. Let me see if I can put a little like shorthand E major here. But yeah, so D, F sharp, and A, or I'm sorry, I should say D sharp, F sharp, A. If we look at this thing here, D sharp, F sharp, top and bottom, and A. So those 3 notes, D sharp, F sharp, A, are here. D sharp, F sharp, A. So that's our 7 chord. So that's the 7 diminished. Now, the F sharp is on the bottom. That's the 3rd of the chord. So what inversion is that?
First inversion.
First inversion. So what little number do I put? 6. Yeah. So then this would be 7 minus 6. And I'm sort of scrunching things in here, by the way, as you can see. It's always a problem with these Bach chorales. They're written so tightly, it's hard to do analysis. But this chord is a 7 diminished 6. And then what about this next chord? Well, let me ask you this. I just thought of something. You can't see that chord. It's hidden. But you know that there's a 7 chord here, right? Where is 7 normally going to go? To 1, right? The only other possibility is 6, but where is 7 going to normally go? To 1. So, instead of thinking, what is this chord? Ask yourself, is this a 1 chord here? Does it have the notes of a 1 chord? Well, G sharp, B, E, B. So it's 1 chord, right? Yeah. In what position?
First inversion?
First inversion, yeah. And so this is a 1, 6. Now also we should notate the non-chord tones too. So in this chord, this E is a non-chord tone. This will help us review non-chord tones. So again, in the course of this thing, this E is a non-chord tone. It's approached by step and left by lead. So what kind of a non-chord tone is that? Approached by step, left by lead. You got to check your notes.
It's been a... Escape?
Escape tone, yeah. Yeah, and it's a little weird because So that, the sopranos hit the E and then jump up to B, but the altos come in with the E right after that. I do think there'll be a little, like, confusion in the ear for the listener to be like, wait a minute, what's happening there, you know? Is this an anticipation, or is it, you know, it is a little weird. And then, now, this is more straightforward. This, if this is a 1/6, then this F sharp is a non-chord tone. What is that?
Neighbor?
No,
Passing.
passing, yeah. It's a passing tone because it's approach by step and left by step in the same direction. We're just passing through that on the way there. Okay. The next one is a little confusing. Because actually what you hear on the downbeat is not the chord itself. So what we're going to hear on beat 4 there is we're going to hear this. And then the next measure is the, but so from the E in first inversion, and then this next chord here, which is this. So we actually don't get the chord right away. But what is that chord?
Is it one?
Yes. 1. So then what is the F sharp? If this is a 1 chord, and so E, G sharp, and B, that's all 1 chord, and then eventually the E is a 1 chord. If this is a 1 chord, what is the F sharp?
Really?
Well, it's a non-chord tone.
Yeah.
And what kind of a non-chord tone is it? And again, this is, yeah. Well, it's a passing tone, just like the other one. You know, here we go E, F sharp, G. Here we go G, F sharp, E. It's just backwards of that. And in fact, the alto and bass voices are kind of gone with that, right? They're just moving apart from each other. But they're just exchanging notes. So here the alto is on E and the basses are on G. And here the altos are on G and the basses are on E. They just switch places. And they've both gone through F sharp to get there. The only difference is that this passing tone is accented, it falls on the beat. This passing tone is unaccented, it comes on a hand with the beat. So it tends to sound, when we have an unaccented passing tone, it tends to be a little, I want to say a little hidden, it's less sudden. So on that one passing tone you hear, you know, that's not a big deal, but then you hear, and that sounds like a big deal, and then you get the A. And that's what's next on the fermata there. Okay, so this next chord is A, E, A, C sharp. What is that?
4.
4, yeah, because in the key of E, A, C sharp, E, A, C sharp, B would be 4. So that's a 4 chord. And then we get to the interesting stuff. So now we have C sharp, I'm sorry, not C sharp, A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, C sharp. So I'm going to put that first like this. If I put like, this is treble clef, A sharp, what's the next one? C sharp, and F sharp. And then there's another C sharp, right? So first of all, it's not in root position, right? How do I put it in root position? here, right, then that's gonna give me a root position chord. Okay. So that's the triad. How would we label this, like in chord symbols? Well, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. Like, what's the root name and quality of that chord?
It's the fifth, the dominant. But it's A sharp.
No, don't think about the key. Don't worry about the key. Yeah, What is it itself? It's an F sharp major chord, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm going for. This is an F sharp major chord. So that's the first step. This is an F sharp major triad. Boom. Okay. Next question. F sharp, this F sharp major triad, is the dominant of what chord or note?
D. Not well.
E. Which is E? No.
We just
Remember, like, if I'm on F sharp and I want to find what it's the dominant of, like, I can go 4 notes up, right?
What was that? No, I said B.
A perfect fourth up would be B,
Yeah.
right? Or if I think in the key of B major, if I think temporarily in the key of B major, this, this F sharp, I'm going to not write out all these, but that F sharp is the fifth note. If I build a major triad there, that's the dominant of B, okay? So an F sharp major triad is the dominant of B. What is B in the key of E? Which step of the scale? Is it the median, the subtone, the leading tone? What is it?
The fifth?
The fifth, yeah, or the dominant. So this chord is the dominant of the dominant. And the shorthand for that is 5/5. We would call this in the key of E. If I had this chord in the key of E, in other words, if I had this, all this with its A sharp, which is not part of the key signature, then I would call that 5 of 5, the dominant of the dominant. So when I label it in my analysis, it's in first inversion because the A sharp is the lowest sounding pitch, that's a third of the chord. When I label it in my analysis, I'm going to call it 5, 6 of 5. Because it is the dominant of the dominant. Right, that's the 5 of 5. So it's 5 of 5 because it is the dominant of the dominant in the key of E. And then the 6 means it's in first inversion. The other thing is that this little note here in the alto, this E, is actually the 7th on top of that chord. So it could sort of become like a 7th kind of thing. I think in this case we could just label it as a passing tone, but just so you're aware of that here's the triad, and then the 7th does come in at some point after that. And it does resolve down by step to the third of the next chord. So, but what we can just do is we can just call it a passing tone. I would say that's one of those weird cases where you could either analyze it this way and call this a passing tone, or you could analyze it this way and not call it that a passing tone. Does that make sense? To get rid of the passing tone. Because in this one, you're not acknowledging this 7th as part of the chord, you're saying it's an unchord tone. In this one, you're saying this 7th is part of the chord, so you get rid of the whole passing tone.
Are there points where you need to use this kind of stuff, or is it just kind of one of those things where it's like, You would just use it just to kind of give it a bit more texture, so to speak.
You know, I think when you're analyzing, you're trying to describe what you would hear. And so if you heard that as like a progression from the chord itself to a seventh, like if you heard that as a seventh, you know, you heard that it's really like triad and seventh, then the resolution, or if you just heard, then you would, you know, so it depends on how you hear it.
Yeah.
And I think people would hear that in different ways, quite honestly. In a Bach chorale, let's say, the tempo on this would probably be, you know, the ba-da-da-da-da-da. So that's a little fast to hear, ba-da-da, you know. Probably not, you know. You would probably just say passing, because you don't really have time to catch that as a seventh, like as a change of harmony. But I'm telling you, if you were taking this, if this was a placement test at CSUN, and they gave you this and said analyze it, and you did either one of these, they'd be fine with that. It really is often a matter of, well, you know, what is your logic? Well, my logic is it's a seventh chord, so I'm not going to call this a passing tone, it's part of the chord, you know. Or my logic is this is a triad, it's a passing tone, you know. But it's got to be consistent. You can't do this Roman numeral analysis and still say that's a passing tone, because it's not. It's part of the chord now, you know. So you just have to be consistent, that's all. In all of these ambiguous cases, you have to be consistent in what you're doing and just showing that you have a certain logic and perception of this. That's fine. Okay, and then we would expect 5, 6 of 5 to resolve to what?
1.
No, 5. You know, because we're doing the dominant of the dominant, so the next chord we would get would be the dominant. Yeah, don't shortcut it. So yeah, the next chord here is 5. And then I just want to go a little bit further because it kind of goes back to our review of harmony. So now we have a B major triad here. What happens here when we get the A natural in there? And I'm just going to say that this C sharp is a neighbor tone. Well, see, okay, this is 5, right? That's B, D, F, B, D sharp, F sharp, B, D sharp, F sharp. A natural comes in.
Oh,
5, 7, yeah. And again, it's gone from A sharp to A natural because that makes this a dominant 7th. This wouldn't be this would be a major 7th if it was A sharp, but it's A natural. So this is a dominant 7th. Now, the A natural is the lowest sounding pitch. So what's the analysis? What's 5? What little numbers do I put next to it? So this is going to be 5. But now the A natural, which is the 7th of the chord, is the lowest sounding pitch. So what inversion?
Third, right?
Third inversion, yeah. And what's our symbols for third inversion?
No.
4, 2.
Alright.
All right, 5, 4, 2. That's when we do a third inversion, dominant 7th, that's any kind of 7th, 4, 2. And then that's always going to go to a 1, 6, because if the 7th is in the bass and the 7th resolves down by step, then that's going to give us the third of the chord in the bass. And so that's going to give us a first inversion 1 chord. Okay, but the main thing is, like, again, this secondary chord here, thinking outside of the key temporarily to analyze that, and then plugging it back into the key. So this this is the dominant of the dominant, so you have to think temporarily in the key of B major, because B major is the dominant, and then you pull it back out and come into E major again. Everybody okay with that? Okay, let's look at the next one. So what key are we in this one? C, yeah. We start on C and we end on C. There's no sharps or flats in the key signature. There are some sharps in the music, right? But not in the key signature. And so we would tend to analyze this in the key of C because we're going to frame it, starting in C and ending in C. But you can see in the middle, F sharp, B flat, F sharp, F sharp, F sharp. So that means something else going on, right? Probably some secondary functions. Okay, so we already said this is a one chord. What is this chord here on the downbeat of the first full measure? G, D, G, B. 5, right? So G major triad, that's our 5. And then this one, with its F sharp, D, D, F sharp, and A. Well, again, first of all, what is that chord? What is its root name and quality? Well, if I have a chord like this, D, F sharp, and A, it's a D major triad, right? Good. And what is that the dominant of? So think 4 notes up, or 5 notes down, G, good, yeah, so that's a G. Now what is G in the key of C? It's this, right? It's 5. So this is 5, 5, yeah. Yeah, so this chord here is 5, 5. And again, I'm scrunching it in because it's so. And we would expect 505 to go to. No. You keep jumping there, Brian. You got to follow the sequence to 5, yeah. Or maybe you're in the new key, like you're still in G major. Yeah. No, I get it. It's actually like in G major you would be correct. So if you're living in G major land, then you're correct. But in C major, no. And but that's seriously kind of part of the game. And I know, again, maybe I don't want to get too philosophical or weird, fantastical about this. But it is almost like you're living in another place for a bit, right?
Yeah.
You're in C major, and then you're visiting G major land for a little bit. Like, I'm driving through, I'm driving through G major, and then now I'm gonna be back in C, and then I'm gonna go somewhere else, But so as you move about, you have to kind of keep conscious of where you are at. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like in a physical sense, right? We do that when we move about physically. Like you're driving around, I'm in Van Nuys. I'm going to drive to Hollywood. I'm going to drive to downtown. And each step of the way, you know where you are,
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in Hollywood, then you know where, what's a good, Santa Monica place, you know. Well, but you understand what I'm saying? Like, so the same thing is true in music. You're in a place, you gotta know where you're at in relation to these other things. Okay. So we did 5. Then, oh, well, wait a minute. I just wanted to bring up this note C too. Again, we'll call it a passing tone, but it is the 7th of that chord. So it's another instance of that kind of that use of that, that again, that strength of the 7th. So the first thing we hear is this, the D major triad, and then it goes like that. And then the next thing we hear is this. That's the chord with the B flat. So this I'm going to have us analyze all as a package. So we've got C, E, and G, but what happens when we bring the B flat in there? So if I take the one chord here,
It's gonna be a 7.
and I add a B flat on top of it, it becomes what?
It's a 7 chord.
Yeah, a C dominant 7th chord, right? A C7. So, since it's a dominant 7th and it's outside of the key of C, what is it the dominant of? C, D, F. Yeah, F. Good. Yeah. Now you're getting in the groove here. And it actually is that same repetition over again. I know it might seem complicated sometimes, but it's that same functioning over and over again. Yeah, so, and we're going to find that resolving to that chord here. So this, instead of calling it C because of this B flat, because it's, again, it's so startling a new harmony. Let me start from the beginning here. So if the first chord, here's our C major triad, here's the G chord, then we get that secondary function, and then we cadence on this chord. And then the next chord we hear is, so that C chord, even though we're there, that B flat really brings, you know. So, we're going to analyze this as 5/4. Actually, 5/7 of 4 because it's a dominant 7. And then it should resolve to 4, and it does. F, A, C, and A. And that's our 4 chord in this key, F, F, A, C. So we get to 4. Now, actually, I will say it is possible to have a deceptive resolution of a secondary dominant, but we don't want to get into that now.
That'd be too much for right now.
Yeah. Well, that's where you get sent off into another land, right? Like, so now you're in Hollywood, and you know that West Hollywood is off to your right, let's say, you're facing south. But then where's Koreatown? I don't know. You know, I can't quite find it. You know, so that's what I mean. Like, it is possible, but we don't want to go there yet. Because you actually have to be kind of like certain of where you're at in order to do those even higher level functions. You know, you want to be centered, shall we say? You know. Okay, and then this next, these two are just passing tones. This next chord, though, D, F, D, and B. Any guesses? No. So if it's D, F, and B, then the root would be B. Yeah, did you just say it? 7? Yeah, it's a 7. It's a 7 convention. In first inversion, which is not. Yeah, so it's 7 to diminished in first inversion, and then we get to 1/4 of the cadence there. And that, see, that progression makes sense, right? 4 to 7 to 1, very typical progression. Okay, well, we don't really need to go on with that. Not enough thinking in the key. So we can erase some of this stuff. All right, let's look at this Mozart music. This is actually a little bit simpler because, so you know, I talked about this before in class, but this is this Bach chorale style, and the harmony changes like every beat, right? So every single quarter note is a new harmony in this Bach chorale style, mostly. In the first one we looked at, there was some repetition, like here's a 1 chord and here's 1 chord. They're voiced differently, but it's the same harmony, right? And then in this one, the next Bach chorale, it's, you know, 1 harmony, different 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 harmony, different. It changes every chord in a beat. That's pretty much the style for a Bach chorale, is for to change every beat or almost every other beat. Now, when we get into the later, like classic era, romantic era, the harmonic rhythm starts to stretch out. And so instead of a different harmony every beat, like we're in 3/4, so it should be like quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, 3 different harmonies. The tendency is to just have the same harmony throughout the measure, and then maybe you rush the harmonic rhythm a little faster towards the cadence point here, but it's slower. The harmonic rhythm is slower or stretched out. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So instead of, you know, change, 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 it's change, 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 change. And then again, a little bit of rush towards the end. So, then also when you're looking at piano music, you're thinking about looking for patterns that represent chords. So if I play that first measure with just the bass part, that actually just makes a single chord. It's just an F major triad. Just FAC, and if I just put my hand on it, and the same is true of the next measure, that's all 1 harmony, and then the next measure, the third measure, that's all 1 harmony. The fourth measure is a little tricky, we'll get to that when we get there, but finally at the very end there with this, the F and A, the very last measure of the example, that's kind of a return to 1, but really what you have is 1 harmony, a different harmony, a different harmony, a third harmony, and then finally the end. So it's not like the harmony is changing every beat. You don't want to analyze this like 1, 1, 6, 1, 6, 4, 1, 6, 1, 6, 4, 1, 6. You know, you don't analyze every single 8 note. You just say, this is 1 harmony. This is another harmony. This is another harmony. Okay? So you don't need to get down into the minutiae, to these small ones. You know the saying, you can't see the forest for the trees? Heard that one? Yeah. So you want to see the forest, not the trees, not the individual notes. Okay. So having said all that, what do you see as a key for this example? Well, one flat is F, right? And again, if we look at this FAC, that's an F major triad, so it's either F major or D minor, right?
Yeah.
This is an F major triad. F, A, F, A. D is a little weird, but you know, this is pretty D major, so we're talking F major. So we're going to analyze this in the context of F major. And it will make sense in the key of F major. It won't make sense in the key of D. So we're going to say F for this one. so if we write out an F major scale, and then the first notes there are F, A, and C. That's one chord, right? Are we okay with that? Okay. Don't need to beat a dead horse, as they say, is another saying, right? Okay, but the next measure is different. It's significant. We have F and C and E flat, and also C and A there. So if we take those notes, I'm just going to do the bass part for now, but I'm going to write it in treble clef just to confuse you. So F and A, F and C. F and C and E flat. And then if we think of this A as sort of sneaking in later on, what is that? What chord? Again, root name and quality. F. Wait. Dominant seven. Yeah. F dominant seven. F 7. Yeah, it is a dominant 7. I mean, we could go through the whole process, but if you're just, well, so what is the F the dominant of? Same question. What is it? B. Yeah. Let's say B flat there, just to be consistent. So, again, if we think of the key of B flat, if we write that out, okay, then F, I'm going to do it this way. F is the dominant. So if we built F, F, A, C, and E flat from the key signature is an F7. So that chord is the dominant in the key of B flat. It's the dominant of B flat. So what is B flat in the key of F? You're not saying number or scale degree?
It's the dominant of the fifth of the scale.
It's not the dominant of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh.
It's the subdominant. Right? Or 4. Or fa, if you want to talk solfege. Again, languages. You know. So, if this is an F dominant set, it's the dominant of the 4 chord, so we would call this 5/7 of 4. It's the dominant of the 4 chord, it's the dominant of the subdominant, and it's going to give us like an extra push towards a 4 chord here. And it's, but you know, so again, kind of like an experiment, you know, in science, you know, like, okay, well, this is 5 of 4, do I get the expected result? Do I get the 4 chord? The notes here are F, B flat, and D. So if I take those notes, F, B flat, and D, and I turn that into a root position, that's a B flat major triad, and that is 4 in the key of F. So I do get the, but the lowest sounding pitch is F, so what inversion is that?
Second?
Yeah, second inversion, yeah. So what do I put for that? 4 what? 4, 6, 4. Yes, good. Then, this note G, so the B flat is part of the chord, but this note G is not. So that's going to be a non-chord tone. Everything else in the piano right-hand part was part of the chord. So the F and the A is part of the one chord. The C and the A is part of the 5, 7, 4. The B flat is part of the 4, but the G is not part of the 4. So what's the name of that non-chord tone? Where I approach it by lead, you can leave it by step. Italian term? Paginatura, yes.
Sounds like it's
Approach by lead, left by step, usually in the opposite direction. So, and this is such a typical paginatura. You know, 'cause let me just play. I'm going to play block chord. So. Dissonant, and then, so it's a dissonance. Actually, it's not really that dissonant. Against the B flat, it's not really dissonant. It's just not part of the chord. Then it resolves downward. So it's an appoggiatura, yeah. Approach by lead, left by step. But so, you know, that really, it's actually a really nice, big major sixth lead bottom. Okay, now we have to deal with this last measure. It's a little naughty, but not terribly so. Naughty, I mean like a board naughty, not like bad naughty. it's a little convoluted. Okay, so how to frame this? Well, let's say so. If we take so we've got F. E and B flat. I'm sorry, F, G and B flat, then we've got E. So if we take those notes, if we take, F, and we take G, and we take B flat, and we take E, E down here. It's like a cluster, right? Doesn't really make sense. So we have to kind of look beyond or outside of what's there, because there's something goofy here, and it's not really making sense to us. But let's put it this way. So if you had 4 and you had 1, and in the middle you had something else, what would be your candidates, like in terms of chord progression? What would you put between a 4 and a 1 chord? 5, yeah. Or 7. Good. No, that's good. Yeah. These are the assumptions we have to make. Do you see a 5 or a 7 in there anywhere? Now, I don't see 5, even though it's a good guess. Good, totally logical. But I don't see a C. I don't see the note C anywhere in that measure. Right? But I do see the G and the B and the E, which are the 7th chord. So if I look at that, if I look at G, B, and E, and I put that in root position, E, G, B, that is the 7th chord in the key of F major. That's this one. That's the 7th diminished. Okay, so that makes sense, right? And it would make sense to say 4, 7 diminished, with the G as the lowest sounding pitch. We'll get to that justification a little bit, and then to say 1 here. So, and again, with analysis, sometimes we're looking for sense. We're trying to draw out sense, if you will. You know. But if somebody says this is all just bullshit, well, you know, I don't know what to say. But okay, so now, what are these 2 Fs then? Because those 2 Fs are not part of the harmony, right? They're not part of our chord. Well, let's take the F down here first. We've got a chord with an F, and then the F stays the same, and then the F stays the same, and then the F stays the same, and then the F stays the same. So is there a name for a non-chord tone that just stays the same and becomes a non-chord?
Pedal for you.
Pedal. There you go. Yay! remember that whole thing about taking like a note that is part of the chord, and then, again, making it something else, and then making it something else, and then finally having it become a non-chord tone, and then becoming part of the chord again. That's a pedal tone. So Mozart is just, he's breaking it up. But it's still all there. So that's a pedal point. And then this F is just a passing tone, approach by step, left by step, on the way to the E, which is part of the chord. That was good. That was good. Again, it's about, it's about thinking what it might be and then experimenting and justifying it. And that makes sense though, right? Now that I've said all that, it makes sense, I hope. Again, you're not saying, well, that's completely crazy. No, it makes sense in terms of the harmonic rhythm, in terms of the flow, in terms of what kind of progression we would have at the end. It does work, and I think, I'm sure Mozart wasn't sitting there going, I'm going to do a 4-6-4 to a 7-6 to a 1, but he was thinking of that logic, with I'm sure it was all just very intuitive for him, but still that harmonic logic, which was ingrained in him because of the music he previously studied, the music he liked to write, would just naturally sort of come out that way. That makes sense? Yeah. Okay. So these secondary dominants, again, are just ways of reinforcing other chords within the key. Like in the case of this, we're in the key of F major, but we're using this F dominant 7 to reinforce the 4 chord, to kind of tonicize the 4 chord. So I think you can especially hear when you just play it in like block chords, when you say, well, this is F, and this is F7, and that's going to take me to B flat, and then that's going to take me to C down. So we're just temporarily tonicizing the B flat chord there. And that's what they're there for. They're there to reinforce certain chords and the relationships between them. Okay? All right. Let's call it quits there. And we will maybe we'll review this a little bit next time.
So just to kind of clarify, so the secondary dominants, they're not exactly used like you need to use them, but it's more or less something you should know in case you need to analyze something.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. You definitely need to know them in analyzing music.
Yeah.
Like you need to understand them and have them part of your vocabulary, let's say, when analyzing. In terms of usage, if you are a composer, you should know them because that it just expands your vocabulary.
Yeah.
It's not part of all diatonic tonal music. Yeah, so they're not everywhere, but it's like a bigger vocabulary, a bigger usage that you have now of these chords.
Like in a sense, this is an easy way for me to kind of say, just knowing that, it's kind of like a little party trick when it comes to like writing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I always feel like, so like this is your universe, and you're in here, then it's maybe hard for you to navigate your own universe, but if you're out here and you have this much knowledge, then this becomes simpler.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So if you understand the chromatic relationships and the diatonic relationships become easier. And when we get to the advanced, like in harmony 3, you get to advanced chromatic relationships and the secondary functions become easier. It's always kind of like a nested sphere of things.
And this is kind of, honestly, it's simple. Obviously, just putting it into practice is not a thing.
Yeah, no, I totally get that, and let me turn this down. I'm lecturing on this stuff here, and you guys are, absorbing it and kind of getting into it, and then you'll go home and it'll kind of go away, but not right away, but I don't want to give you some sort of suggestion, you know. But it'll slip a little bit.
Yeah.
So then you gotta kind of go back at it again.
Yeah.
But yeah, once it becomes more part of your, you know, what you do normally, then it becomes more natural. And so if you were writing a piece, Brian, you might go, hey, you know, maybe I will put it in this like 5-5.
Just for the hell of it.
Hmm?
I'm just like, just for the hell of it. Let me just put this one in there.
Well, let me see how that would sound. You know, like
Yeah.
I'm playing around on the keyboard. Let me see what that would be like if I did this, you know, like E dominant 7 before I did my A minor triad. You know,
Yeah.
that might be kind of cool, and it works. So that's what I mean by it expands your vocabulary.
Yeah.
You know, it gives you something else to use in terms of approach, except just the white keys on the piano.
Yeah.
So, okay. All right. Do you know if Stephanie's coming next week?
I think she said she just wasn't coming this week.
This-
I think she was.
Yeah.
I think next week she was coming.
Okay, so next we'll do, so in addition to these secondary dominants, there are what are called secondary leading tones. Because we can approach tonic in two ways, right? From dominant, from 5 to 1 and 7 to 1.
Yeah.
And so we'll get into the 7 to 1 group.